The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Boston Federal Courthouse as Judge Lucas Rivera adjusted his black robes. 25 years of memories threatened to surface, but he pushed them down with the same disciplined resolve that had earned him his seat on the bench. Today wasn't about the past. At least that's what he kept telling himself. Your Honor. His clerk, Richard Chen, appeared at his chamber door, manila folder in hand. The Rivera versus United. States files you requested. Lucas felt the weight of his own surname hanging in the air. Thank you, Richard. He accepted the folder, his fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside. Has the defendant arrived? Yes, sir. Mr. Rivera. Richard hesitated, clearly aware of the connection but professional enough not to mention it, is waiting with his defense team. The young clerk's discretion was appreciated. In the 3 years Richard had worked for him, they'd developed an unspoken understanding. No personal questions, no matter how many whispers echoed through the courthouse halls. Lucas opened the folder, though he'd memorized its contents days ago. The charges against Daniel Rivera read like a greatest hits album of white-collar crime, wire fraud, money laundering, obstruction of justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd abandoned his family for his mistress 25 years ago now stood accused of betraying the very legal system he'd sworn to uphold. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called, knowing who it would be. Maria Rivera entered, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant bun, her dress as immaculate as her reputation as one of Boston's most respected child advocates. She'd raised Lucas alone, transforming her pain into purpose, helping countless children of broken homes find their way. Mommy, he said softly, reverting to Spanish as he often did in private moments with her. You didn't have to come. Of course I did. She crossed the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. My son is about to face the greatest challenge of his career. Where else would I be? Lucas stood towering over his petite mother. I can recuse myself. Judge Henderson would take the case. No. Maria's voice was gentle but firm. You earned your position through integrity, mi amor. This case landed on your docket for a reason. Because the universe has a twisted sense of humor? He attempted a smile, but it felt forced. Because sometimes justice requires more than law books and precedents. She reached up, straightening his tie with familiar precision. It requires strength of character. Lucas caught her hand, holding it for a moment. I learned that from you, and now you'll teach it to others. She stepped back, studying him with eyes that had seen both tragedy and triumph, including him. The unspoken name hung between them: Daniel, father, betrayer, defendant. The evidence is substantial, Lucas said, his judicial mask slipping back into place. The FBI's case. I didn't come to discuss the evidence. Maria moved toward the door. I came to remind you who you are. You're not that 5-year-old boy anymore crying because his father chose another life. You're Judge Lucas Rivera, and whatever happens in that courtroom today, I'm proud of the man you've become. The words wrapped around him like armor. He'd needed them, though he hadn't known how much until this moment. The gallery will be full, he warned. Are you sure you want to? I'll be there. She paused at the door. Someone should witness what real integrity looks like. After she left, Lucas returned to his desk, scanning the photographs submitted as evidence. The offshore accounts, the coded messages, the paper trail leading to his father's door. Everything pointed to guilt. But that wasn't his concern. His job wasn't to determine innocence or guilt based on his personal history. It was to ensure the law was applied fairly, without prejudice or passion. He thought of his mother's words about strength of character, about integrity, about the kind of justice that transcended legal statutes. The intercom buzzed. Richard's voice came through, crisp and professional. Your Honor, they're ready for you. Lucas stood, adjusting his robes one final time. His mind, he was no longer the abandoned son or the wounded child. He was simply a servant of justice, bound by oath and honor to see truth prevail. "Very well," he replied, gathering the files. "Let's begin." As he stepped toward his courtroom, Lucas felt the weight of 2.5 decades settling onto his shoulders. Every step brought him closer to the moment he'd both dreaded and, in some secret corner of his soul, longed for. The moment when he would look into his father's eyes not as a betrayed son, but as an arbiter of justice. The heavy doors loomed before him. Beyond them waited Daniel Rivera, the man who had shaped his life through absence rather than presence. The man whose actions had driven Lucas to become everything his father was not: honest, faithful, uncompromising in his principles. "All rise," came the bailiff's voice from within. Lucas took a deep breath, channeling every lesson his mother had taught him about dignity in the face of pain. Then, with the same quiet strength that had carried him through 25 years of rebuilding, he pushed open the doors to face his past and deliver justice, whatever the cost might be. Daniel Rivera had imagined this moment countless times over the past 25 years. In his dreams, his son wore Little League uniforms or graduation robes, not the black judicial garments that now draped his powerful frame. The courtroom fell silent as Lucas entered, his presence commanding respect that had nothing to do with his position and everything to do with the quiet dignity he carried. Case number 2025 CR 1142, United States versus Daniel Rivera. The clerk announced, his voice echoing through the hushed chamber. The Honorable Judge Lucas Rivera presiding. From his position at the defense table, Daniel studied his son's face, searching for traces of the 5-year-old boy who used to beg for bedtime stories. Instead, he found an impassive mask, carved by years of dedication to justice rather than shaped by a father's love. "Are both parties ready to proceed?" Lucas's voice carried the crisp authority of someone who'd earned his position through merit rather than connections. "Ready for the prosecution, Your Honor." Assistant U.S. Attorney Regina Walsh stood, her burgundy suit as sharp as her reputation. She'd built her career taking down corrupt lawyers and judges, and her presence signaled how seriously the government took this case. "Ready for the defense." Michael Reeves, Daniel's attorney, rose beside him. They'd been friends for 30 years, but even that relationship had been strained by the evidence the FBI had uncovered. Lucas nodded, his dark eyes sweeping the courtroom without lingering on any one person. Not even on Maria, who sat in the front row, her spine straight and her expression unreadable. "Ms. Walsh, you may proceed with your opening statement." Regina Walsh moved to the center of the courtroom with measured steps. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about trust. Trust given and trust betrayed. The defendant, Daniel Rivera, was more than just a lawyer. He was a guardian of justice, sworn to uphold the very laws he's accused of breaking." Daniel watched Lucas's face for any reaction to the word betrayal, but his son remained stoic, taking notes with practiced precision. The same hands that once reached for him in trust now recorded the evidence of his alleged crimes. "The prosecution will prove that over a period of 6 years, Mr. Rivera orchestrated an elaborate scheme to launder money for the Valdez drug cartel through his law firm's client accounts. We will show how he used his position of trust to facilitate the movement of over $50 million in drug profits, all while maintaining the facade of a respectable attorney." The words hit Daniel like physical blows. Not because they were false. He'd had months to come to terms with the charges, but because they were being heard by the two people whose opinion of him couldn't possibly sink lower. And yet somehow it had. "The evidence will demonstrate a pattern of deception that goes beyond mere criminal conduct," Walsh continued. "Mr. Rivera created shell companies, falsified documents, and corrupted the very system he swore to serve. The prosecution will present bank records, witness testimony, and surveillance evidence that will leave no doubt about the defendant's guilt." From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw Maria shift slightly in her seat. She'd always had a tell when she was disturbed. A small adjustment of her shoulders. Barely noticeable unless you'd spent years learning her body language. Some things, it seemed, never changed. "Defense counsel," Lucas spoke, his tone perfectly neutral. "Are you ready to present your opening statement?" Michael Reeves stood, straightening his tie. "Yes, Your Honor." As his friend approached the jury, Daniel found his attention drawn to Lucas's hands. They were his mother's hands, elegant, precise, capable of both gentleness and strength. Had anyone else noticed? Did anyone else in this courtroom understand the weight of family history pressing down on this moment? "Ladies and gentlemen," Reeves began, "the prosecution has painted a picture of deliberate corruption. But what they haven't told you is that Daniel Rivera has spent 40 years building a reputation for ethical practice. They haven't mentioned his pro bono work for immigrant families, or the countless hours he's dedicated to mentoring young lawyers." Daniel almost wished his friend would stop. Each accomplishment mentioned felt like a mockery when weighed against his greatest failure, the destruction of his own family. He looked at Lucas again, wondering if his son remembered the promises he'd broken, the birthdays he'd missed, the graduations he'd learned about through courthouse gossip. "The defense will show that Mr. Rivera was himself a victim of sophisticated criminal manipulation. We will demonstrate how the Valdez cartel targeted his firm, using legitimate-seeming business transactions to conceal their true activities. My client's only crime was trusting the wrong people, a mistake that cost him dearly but not a criminal act." Lucas's pen paused briefly on his notepad. The slight hesitation might have gone unnoticed by others, but to Daniel, it spoke volumes. Trust. It always came back to trust. "The evidence will show that Daniel Rivera cooperated fully with federal investigators once he became aware of the cartel's activities. His actions were those of an honest man caught in a web of deception, not a willing participant in criminal enterprise." As Reeves continued, Daniel found his thoughts drifting to the last time he'd seen Lucas as a child. It was a Sunday morning, warm for October. He'd packed his bags while Lucas slept, too cowardly to face his son's tears. By the time the boy woke up, Daniel was gone, leaving behind a family he'd destroyed for the promise of passion with Maria's best friend, a relationship that hadn't survived its first year of scandal. "The defense rests, Your Honor." "Thank you, Counselor." Lucas's voice brought Daniel back to the present. "We'll proceed with the prosecution's first witness. Ms. Walsh?" The government calls Special Agent Christopher Martinez. As the FBI agent was sworn in, Daniel watched his son's methodical preparation for witness testimony. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture controlled. Lucas had learned to handle power with responsibility, something Daniel had failed to teach him, but that he'd mastered anyway. The questioning began, and with it, the systematic dismantling of Daniel's carefully constructed defenses. Bank statements appeared on screens. Surveillance photos were entered into evidence. His signature on damning documents was enlarged for the jury's inspection. Through it all, Lucas presided with unwavering focus, ruling on objections with swift certainty, clarifying points of law with precise language. He showed no sign that the man being exposed as a criminal was the same one who had once taught him to ride a bike, who had abandoned him for what turned out to be a fleeting affair. The morning session stretched into afternoon. As the sun shifted, it caught the silver in Maria's hair, creating a brief halo effect. She hadn't aged so much as refined, her beauty tempered by wisdom rather than diminished by time. She sat through each revelation without flinching, her presence a silent reminder of the strength it took to rebuild after devastation. "Court will recess until 9 tomorrow morning," Lucas announced as the day drew to a close. "Counselors, I expect your witness list finalized by then." The bang of the gavel echoed through the chamber. Daniel stood with the others, watching as his son disappeared behind the judicial chamber's door. In less than 8 hours, every carefully constructed justification he'd built over 25 years had begun to crumble. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, more proof of his failures, both legal and personal. But for now, all he could think about was the way Lucas had looked at him exactly once during the entire proceeding, not as a father, not as a criminal, but as what he had become, a stranger before the law. The bailiff approached to escort him back to detention. As he turned to leave, Daniel caught a glimpse of Maria comforting a younger woman who'd been crying quietly in the back row. Another mother, perhaps, whose family had been touched by his crimes. Even now she was helping others heal from wounds like the ones he'd inflicted. The heavy doors closed behind him, and Daniel Rivera, once a respected attorney, now a defendant in his own son's courtroom, began the long walk back to his cell, where he would spend another night contemplating justice, betrayal, and the true cost of the choices he'd made 25 years ago. The second day of trial began with a thunderstorm. Lightning illuminated the courthouse windows as special Agent Martinez returned to the stand, his testimony zeroing in on a series of transactions that had first caught the FBI's attention. "Please explain to the jury what you see in Government Exhibit 47, Regina Walsh directed, gesturing to the screen where a complex web of financial transfers was displayed. Lucas leaned forward slightly, studying the document with the same intensity he'd once applied to his law school textbooks. The movement triggered a memory in Daniel. His son at age 4, brow furrowed in concentration as he assembled a puzzle, refusing help even then. "These transfers show a pattern," Martinez explained, using a laser pointer to highlight specific entries. Every 3 months, exactly $2.4 million would move through a series of shell companies before being cleaned through Mr. Rivera's client trust accounts. A juror in the front row, a middle-aged teacher with questioning eyes, scribbled furiously in her notepad. Daniel wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A criminal mastermind or a foolish man who'd lost everything that mattered chasing things that didn't? "And what happened to the money after it passed through the defendant's accounts?" Walsh pressed. "Objection, Your Honor." Michael Reeves stood. "Calls for speculation." Lucas's response was immediate and measured. "Overruled. The witness may answer based on the evidence tracked during the investigation." Daniel watched his son's judicial demeanor with a mixture of pride and regret. Even now, facing the man who'd shattered his childhood, Lucas showed no hint of bias or emotion. He'd become everything Daniel had failed to be: principled, steadfast, true to his obligations. "The money was divided," Martinez continued, "with 70% moving to accounts in the Cayman Islands and 30% remaining in Mr. Rivera's control. Based on our investigation, this 30% represented his fee for laundering the cartel's drug profits." The word cartel seemed to hang in the air. Daniel felt Maria's gaze from her spot in the gallery, though he didn't dare turn to meet it. Instead, his mind drifted to another stormy day 25 years ago. The kitchen of their old house in Brookline, thunder rolling outside. 5-year-old Lucas sitting at the breakfast table, chocolate milk untouched, asking the question Daniel had dreaded. "But why can't you and Mommy fix it?" "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that can't be fixed," he'd answered, already knowing he was choosing the coward's path. "Sometimes they have to start over. But I don't want to start over. I want our family." Daniel had no answer then. He had no answer now. "Your Honor?" Walsh's voice cut through the memory. "May we approach?" Lucas nodded, and both attorneys moved to the bench. Daniel watched their hushed conference, noting how his son's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly as Walsh handed him a document. Even after all these years, he could still read the subtle signs of Lucas's stress, a knowledge that felt like stolen intimacy now. "The prosecution may proceed," Lucas announced after a moment. "But tread carefully, Ms. Walsh. This line of questioning must stick to relevant financial evidence." The next hour brought a parade of bank statements, wire transfers, and damning email exchanges. Daniel's own words appeared on screen after screen, each message another nail in the coffin of his defense. He'd been careful, yes, but not careful enough. The hubris that had led him to destroy his family had eventually led him here, to public exposure and disgrace in his own son's courtroom. During a brief recess, Daniel observed Lucas conferring with his clerk, Richard Chen. The young man's efficiency reminded him of Maria, the same quiet competence, the same underlying strength. She'd chosen well in helping Lucas select his staff, assuming she had. There was so much about his son's life he didn't know. When court resumed, the prosecution called their key witness, Antonio Valdez, a former cartel lieutenant turned state's evidence. As Valdez took the stand, Daniel felt the temperature in the courtroom drop. This man had been his primary contact, the one who'd first approached him with what seemed like legitimate business opportunities. Now he would detail exactly how Daniel had fallen into their web, or perhaps jumped willingly, seduced by the promise of wealth and power. "Mr. Valdez," Walsh began, "please tell the court about your first meeting with the defendant." "Objection." Reeves was on his feet. "Your Honor, the defense maintains that any testimony from Mr. Valdez should be excluded, based on our previous motion regarding—" Lucas held up a hand, silencing the objection mid-sentence. "Counselor, we addressed this in chambers. The witness's testimony is admissible with the agreed-upon limitations. Proceed, Ms. Walsh." Valdez settled into his narrative, his accent, slight but noticeable. "I met Mr. Rivera at the Belmont Club in March 2019. We knew his reputation, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who had, flexible principles when it came to money." Daniel felt the words like physical blows. Flexible principles. Was that what had led him to abandon his family? To betray not just his profession but his own flesh and blood? "And how did you know about his principles?" Walsh asked. "We did research. We knew about his past, about the scandal with his wife's friend, about leaving his family for her." Valdez's eyes flickered briefly to Lucas. "We knew he could be bought." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Daniel saw Maria's hand fly to her throat, her old tell when she was trying to maintain composure. Lucas's gavel cracked against the sound block. "Order," he commanded, his voice steady despite what must have been churning beneath the surface. "The jury will disregard the witness's last statement. Ms. Walsh, control your witness." "Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Valdez, please restrict your testimony to relevant financial matters." But the damage was done. The connection had been drawn between Daniel's personal failings and his professional crimes. He'd been marked as a man who could be bought, who would trade loyalty for desire, integrity for gain. The rest of Valdez's testimony was a methodical destruction of every defense Daniel had planned. Dates, amounts, meetings, all laid bare under Walsh's skilled questioning. Through it all, Lucas maintained his professional mask, ruling on objections, with unwavering fairness, clarifying points of law when necessary. As the day drew to a close, one final piece of evidence appeared on the courtroom screens, a surveillance photo from a restaurant in Miami. Daniel recognized it immediately, the night he'd accepted his first payment from the cartel. The date, stamp in the corner, read June 15, 2019. "Your Honor," Walsh said, "I'd like to draw the court's attention to this date." "The relevance, Counselor?" Lucas asked, though Daniel suspected his son already knew. This was the defendant's first confirmed meeting with cartel members where money changed hands. June 15, 2019 was also— "Objection," Reeves interrupted. "Relevance." Lucas's pen stilled on his notepad. June 15, 2019. His law school graduation day. The day he'd become Judge Rivera. The day his father had chosen to seal his fate with blood money rather than attend his only son's greatest achievement.
"Oh."
"Sustained," Lucas ruled, his voice carrying only the slightest tremor, imperceptible to anyone who hadn't once known every nuance of his speech. "Ms. Walsh, move on." The rest of the day's testimony passed in a blur of numbers and dates. When Lucas finally called for adjournment, Daniel felt decades older than when he'd entered the courtroom that morning. As the bailiff led him toward the door, he caught a glimpse of his son gathering his papers, head bowed in concentration or perhaps prayer. In that moment, Daniel realized that the true verdict in this case had been decided long ago, not by evidence or testimony, but by the choices he'd made. Every betrayal, every abandoned responsibility, every selfish decision had led him here, to judgment not just by the law, but by the son he'd taught to value justice above all else. The eye, heavy doors closed behind him, leaving Lucas and Maria in the emptying courtroom, their dignified presence a testament to everything he'd thrown away. Tomorrow would bring more evidence, more witnesses, more proof of his crimes. But tonight, in his cell, Daniel Rivera would face the harshest judge of all, his own conscience, finally awakened to the true cost of betrayal. The third day of Trial brought unexpected testimony that threatened to shatter Lucas's carefully maintained composure. Regina Walsh approached the bench, her expression grave as she handed both Lucas and defense counsel a sealed envelope. Your Honor, the prosecution has just received new evidence that we believe is crucial to establishing the defendant's state of mind during the period in question. Lucas opened the envelope, his judicial mask slipping for just a moment as he recognized its contents. Inside was a letter, handwritten on his law school graduation announcement, never sent but apparently preserved in Daniel's personal files seized by the FBI. "Counsel, approach," he commanded, his voice tight with controlled emotion. As the attorneys gathered at the bench, Daniel strained to see what had caused the subtle shift in his son's demeanor. The letter. He'd forgotten about the letter, written, in a moment of rare honesty but never delivered, like so many other attempts at bridging the gulf he'd created. "Ms. Walsh," Lucas spoke in hushed tones, "you're aware of the potential complications this evidence presents?" "Yes, Your Honor. However, the letter directly references financial decisions made by the defendant during the period of alleged criminal activity. Its probative value—" "Objection, Your Honor," Reeves interrupted. "This is clearly prejudicial. The prosecution is attempting to manipulate the court's unique situation." Lucas studied the letter again, his eyes lingering on certain phrases. "My son graduates tomorrow and I should be there, but this deal could set us up for life. Maybe someday he'll understand why I made the choices I did." In the gallery, Maria leaned forward slightly, recognizing the tension in her son's shoulders. 25 years of single motherhood had taught her every nuance of Lucas's body language. "The letter will be admitted," Lucas ruled finally, "but with redactions. We'll break for lunch while counsel prepares an appropriate version. Court is in recess until 2 p.m. As the courtroom cleared, Richard Chen appeared at Lucas's side with a stack of files. "Your Honor, Judge Henderson is available if you'd like to discuss—" "No." Lucas's response was firm but quiet. "I won't recuse myself now. The damage would be greater than any benefit." In his chambers, Lucas paced the length of his office, the letter haunting him with every step. The words were like razors, cutting through years of carefully constructed professional distance. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Richard with lunch. Instead, Maria entered carrying a familiar brown paper bag. "You still skip meals when you're stressed," she said, placing the bag on his desk. "Some things never change." Lucas smiled despite himself. "Pastrami on rye." "From Goldman's, just like when you were studying for the bar." She perched on the edge of his desk, her presence both comforting and strengthening. "Want to talk about it?" He handed her the letter. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to pain to something harder to define. "He chose money over your graduation," she said finally. "Just like he chose passion over family all those years ago." "The letter is relevant to establishing pattern and intent," Lucas said, slipping into legal analysis like a protective shield. "His decision to pursue illegal financial gain over family obligations—" "Mi amor," Maria interrupted gently. "I didn't ask for the judge's opinion, I asked if you wanted to talk about it." Lucas sank into his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of every second spent maintaining his professional facade. "I remember that day, at graduation. I kept scanning the crowd even though I knew he wouldn't be there. You gave the valedictorian speech anyway. Made me so proud I thought my heart would burst. Because you taught me that other people's choices don't define us." He picked up the letter again. "But now I have to decide if his words, his admission of choosing money over family, should help send him to prison." Maria touched his hand briefly. "You'll make the right decision. Not because he's your father, but because you're you." The afternoon session began with the redacted letters presentation. Walsh questioned her next witness, a forensic accountant, about the timeline it established. The defendant's notes indicate he was aware of the illegal nature of these transactions as early as June 2019, the accountant testified. The letter references a specific deal coinciding with significant transfers through the Cayman Islands accounts. From his position on the bench, Lucas watched the jury's reactions. The forewoman, a retired librarian with kind eyes, glanced between Daniel and Lucas, clearly connecting dots that the evidence made impossible to ignore. "And what was the total amount transferred during this period?" Walsh asked. "Approximately $12 million routed through a series of shell corporations established by Mr. Rivera's firm." In the defendant's chair, Daniel sat perfectly, still his eyes fixed on some middle distance. Was he seeing the past? The moments and choices that had led him here? The graduation ceremony he'd missed for blood money? The cross-examination brought a shift in tone as Michael Reeves attempted to contextualize the letter. "Isn't it possible," Reeves suggested, "that my client was referring to legitimate business opportunities? The letter itself doesn't specify." "Objection," Walsh interrupted. "The witness has already established the correlation between the date of the letter and documented illegal transfers." Lucas felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom as they waited for his ruling. The law was clear. The evidence was relevant. But for the first time since the trial began, he felt the full impact of his dual role: son and judge, wounded child and arbiter of justice. "Overruled," he said finally. "But the jury will remember that the letter alone is not proof of criminal intent. It must be considered in context with all evidence presented." The afternoon wore on, each piece of testimony another brick in the wall of evidence. Bank statements, wire transfers, surveillance photos. The prosecution was building an airtight case, and Lucas found himself simultaneously impressed by their thoroughness and devastated by their success. During a brief sidebar, he caught fragments of a whispered conversation between Daniel and his attorney. Could still take the plea deal. 20 years instead of life. Lucas forced himself to focus on the legal pad before him, drawing precise lines between notes as if they could somehow divide his personal pain from his professional duty. The day's final witness was a former employee from Daniel's firm, a young paralegal who'd noticed discrepancies in the accounting, but had been too afraid to report them. "Mr. Rivera told me to mind my own business," she testified, her voice trembling slightly. "He said some questions were better left unasked." As she spoke, Lucas remembered another conversation about unasked questions, the day he'd learned his father wasn't coming back. "Sometimes," Maria had told him, "the hardest part of being strong is accepting that we may never get the answers we want." When court adjourned for the day, Lucas remained on the bench, reviewing his notes long after the gallery had cleared. The evidence was mounting, each day bringing new proof of his father's crimes. Yet somehow it was the undelivered letter that threatened to breach his professional walls. Richard appeared with the next day's schedule, his quiet efficiency a welcome anchor to routine. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "Judge Henderson asked me to remind you that recusal is still an option." Lucas looked up from his notes, catching his reflection in the courtroom's darkened windows. He saw what others must see. The son sitting in judgment of his father, the abandoned child now holding the power to determine his abandoner's fate. "No," he said finally. "Justice doesn't get to hide from difficult truths. Neither do I." As he gathered his papers, Lucas thought about the letter that had shaken his composure. His father had written about choices and understanding, about decisions that couldn't be undone. Tomorrow would bring more evidence, more testimony, more proof of those choices. But tonight, in the quiet of his chambers, Lucas Rivera would remember his mother's words about strength and acceptance, about the difference between getting answers and finding peace. The letter had revealed one truth, but the trial was revealing another. Sometimes justice required more than interpreting law. Sometimes it required facing the past without flinching, even when every instinct screamed for retreat. Tomorrow would test that strength again, but for now, Lucas simply sat in the growing darkness, letting the weight of duty and memory settle around him like his judicial robes. The defense's opening day dawned clear and cold. Boston's January, wind whipping between the courthouse columns. Michael Reeves stood before the bench, his usually confident demeanor tempered by the weight of what was to come. "Your Honor, the defense calls Daniel Rivera to the stand." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. In the gallery, Maria's hand tightened on her purse strap, her only visible reaction to the announcement. Lucas maintained his composure, though. Something flickered behind his eyes as the bailiff led Daniel to the witness stand. "Please state your name for the record," Reeves began after the oath was administered. "Daniel Joseph Rivera." His voice carried the strain of days in detention, but retained the practiced resonance of decades in courtrooms. "Mr. Rivera, how long have you practiced law?" 42 years. I was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1983. Lucas watched, his father's testimony with the same careful attention he'd given every witness, his pen moving steadily across the legal pad. But there was something different now, a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been present during the prosecution's case. "And during those 42 years, Reeves continued, what was your reputation in the legal community?" "Objection," Walsh called from the prosecution table. "Calls for speculation." "I'll rephrase," Reeves adjusted smoothly. "Mr. Rivera, please tell the court about your pro bono work with immigrant families." Daniel's eyes softened slightly. "I started the immigrant defense program at Rivera and Associates in 1990. We provided free legal services to families facing deportation, helped with asylum applications, reunited children with parents." His voice trailed off as he glanced at Lucas, the irony of his words hanging heavy in the air. He'd helped reunite countless families while destroying his own. "And how many families did your program help?" "Over 3,000, across 4 decades." Reeves nodded, moving closer to the witness stand. "Why did you focus on immigrant families specifically?" "My own parents came from Puerto Rico with nothing but hope and determination. My father worked 3 jobs to put me through law school. I wanted to honor their sacrifice by helping others. Hike them." In his judge's chair, Lucas remembered the grandparents he'd barely known. They'd passed away when he was young, but he still had fragments of memories. His grandfather's calloused hands, his grandmother's cinnamon-scented kitchen. They'd stopped speaking to Daniel after he left Maria. "Let's talk about the Valdez cartel." Reeves shifted gears. "When did you first become aware that your firm might be involved with criminal enterprises?" Daniel straightened in his chair. "By the time I realized what was happening, I was already trapped. They had compromising information, threats against employees." "Objection," Walsh interrupted. "Narrative." "Sustained," Lucas ruled, his voice steady. "Please respond directly to the question asked, Mr. Rivera." Daniel nodded, accepting his son's authority with a humility that seemed to surprise some courtroom observers. "I first suspected criminal involvement in late 2019 after noticing irregularities in certain client accounts." "And what actions did you take upon making these discoveries?" Daniel hesitated, his facade cracking slightly. "I convinced myself that investigating too deeply would put people at risk. I told myself I was protecting my employees, my clients. But the truth is I was protecting myself, my lifestyle, my reputation." Reeves paused, obviously thrown by his client's unexpected candor. "Mr. Rivera, are you saying you knowingly continued working with the cartel?" "Objection." Walsh was on her feet. "Counsel is leading his own witness." "Sustained," Lucas said, then added, "Mr. Reeves, control your witness." But Daniel seemed beyond control now, years of guilt finally finding voice. "I made choices, terrible choices. First, with my family, then with my practice. Each time I told myself I had good reasons that the ends justified the means. But sitting here now, looking at what I've become—" "Your Honor," Reeves pleaded, "may we have a brief recess?" Lucas studied his father's face, the deep lines of regret, the haunted eyes, the trembling hands that had once pushed him on a swing, then pushed him away. "Granted. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the bailiff led Daniel from the stand, Maria slipped out of the courtroom. Lucas watched her go, understanding her need for space. Some truths were harder to hear than others. In his chambers, Lucas stood at the window looking out over the city. The defense was crumbling, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of fighting the charges, Daniel seemed to be using his testimony as a confession, not just of his crimes, but of his failures as a father. Richard appeared with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. Judge Henderson called again. He's worried about... I know what he's worried about. Lucas cut him off, gentler than the words might suggest. But this needs to finish as it started. When court resumed, Daniel had regained some of his composure. Reeves tried to redirect the testimony toward more favorable territory, discussing Daniel's cooperation with federal investigators after his arrest. You voluntarily provided information about cartel operations, correct? Yes, names, accounts, shipping routes, everything I knew. And why did you choose to cooperate? Daniel's eyes found Lucas, then Maria, who had returned to her seat. Because I finally understood that there are some mistakes you can't fix with more lies. Sometimes the only way forward is through the truth, no matter how much it costs. Walsh's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. She walked Daniel through each criminal transaction, each decision point, each opportunity he'd had to stop but didn't. Mr. Rivera, isn't it true that you received over $15 million in cartel money for your services? Yes. And what did you do with those funds? Daniel's voice was barely audible. I bought a house in the Berkshires, a boat, investments, things I thought would make me happy. Did they? Objection, Reeves called. Relevance. Lucas paused before ruling, watching his father's face. Overruled. The witness may answer. No, Daniel said simply. Nothing could fill the void left by my choices. The afternoon continued with a parade of character witnesses, fellow attorneys, community leaders, grateful clients. Each testified to Daniel's reputation, his charitable work, his legal brilliance. But under Walsh's cross-examination, a pattern emerged. None of them knew him well personally. He'd kept everyone at arm's length, building a facade of respectability while hiding his deepest failures. As the day drew to a close, Reeves called his final witness, Father Michael O'Malley, the prison chaplain who'd been counseling Daniel since his arrest. Mr. Rivera came to me broken, the priest testified, not by his arrest or the charges, but by the weight of his own conscience. He spoke constantly of his family, of the son he'd abandoned, of the wife he'd betrayed. Lucas noticed Maria dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. In all the years since Daniel's departure, he'd never seen her cry over him, not once. Objection, Walsh said quietly. Privileged communication between clergy and penitent. Sustained, Lucas ruled. The jury will disregard the witness's last statement. But the damage, or perhaps the healing, was already done. The image of Daniel as a calculating criminal had been complicated by glimpses of a man drowning in regret, seeking absolution not just from the law but from the family he'd destroyed. When court adjourned, Lucas remained in his chair, watching as the bailiff led his father away. The defense's case wasn't what anyone had expected. Instead of fighting the charges, Daniel seemed to be using his testimony to lay bare not just his crimes, but the character flaws that had led to them. Later, alone in his chambers, Lucas found a note from Maria. Dinner at my place tonight, no excuses. He smiled, knowing she'd make his favorite comfort food, arroz con gandules, just like his grandmother used to make. Some traditions survived even the worst storms. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, jury instructions, deliberation. But tonight, Lucas would sit in his childhood home with his mother, both of them processing the unexpected turn the defense had taken. Sometimes, he reflected, the hardest truths came not from prosecution evidence, but from a defendant's own heart. The morning of closing arguments filled the courtroom with electric tension. Regina Walsh rose from the prosecution table, her burgundy suit a stark contrast against the wood paneling. Behind her, the evidence screens displayed a final damning array of financial records and surveillance photos. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed chamber. Over the past week, you've heard a story of betrayal, not just of the law, but of every principle an attorney swears to uphold. Lucas noticed how his father seemed to shrink in his chair, the weight of Walsh's words pressing him down like physical blows. The evidence has shown, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Daniel Rivera didn't stumble into crime. He didn't make a single mistake in judgment. He made calculated decisions day after day, year after year, to profit from human suffering. In the gallery, Maria sat with perfect posture, her face a mask of composure. Only Lucas could see how tightly she gripped her rosary beads, the same ones his grandmother had brought from Puerto Rico decades ago. The defense would have you believe Mr. Rivera was a victim of circumstance trapped by cartel threats and manipulation, but the evidence tells a different story. Walsh approached the jury box, her movements deliberate. The first transfer of illegal funds occurred on June 15, 2019, a date that held special significance. Lucas's pen stilled on his notepad. His law school graduation, the day he'd become Judge Rivera, while his father was selling his soul to criminals. Mr. Rivera chose that specific day to begin his criminal enterprise, not because of threats, not because of manipulation, but because he had an opportunity to make millions by betraying everything the law stands for. From his position on the bench, Lucas could see the jury forewoman's reaction, a slight narrowing of eyes, a small nod. The symbolism of the date wasn't lost on her. The prosecution has presented bank records showing over $50 million in cartel money flowing through Rivera and Associates. We've shown you surveillance footage, email exchanges, wire transfers. But perhaps most damning is the defendant's own testimony. Walsh paused, letting the silence emphasize her next words. Yesterday you heard Mr. Rivera admit to his crimes, not because he had to, but because, in his words, some mistakes you can't fix with more lies. Yet this moment of honesty comes only after being caught, only after his crimes were exposed, only after he ran out of options for escape. The quiet in the courtroom was absolute. Even the usual shuffle of papers and creaking of chairs had ceased, as if the whole room was holding its breath. The law is clear, Walsh continued. Money laundering for drug cartels carries a minimum sentence of 20 years. Mr. Rivera's position as an officer of the court makes his crimes even more serious. He didn't just break the law, he betrayed the very system of justice he swore to serve. Lucas maintained his judicial composure, but inside, each word resonated with a deeper truth. His father had betrayed not just the law, but every principle he'd claimed to value. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant's guilt is clear. Now it's your duty to ensure justice is served, not because Mr. Rivera is a fallen attorney, but because no one, regardless of their position or past achievements, is above the law. As Walsh returned to her seat, Michael Reeves stood for the defense's closing argument. His usual confidence seemed tempered by the weight of what his client had revealed during testimony. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we've heard much about betrayal during this trial, about choices and consequences, about the price of wrong decisions. The prosecution has painted my client as a calculating criminal, motivated solely by greed. But the truth, as you've seen, is more complex." Reeves moved closer to the jury box, his voice softening. Daniel Rivera did make terrible choices. He's admitted to them openly, showing a level of remorse rarely seen in this courthouse. But to understand those choices, you must understand the man. Lucas watched as Reeves gestured to the evidence of his father's pro bono work. Photographs of grateful families, letters of thanks, news clippings about successful asylum cases. For 40 years, Mr. Rivera used his legal expertise to help others. The immigrant defense program he founded has helped thousands of families find safety and security in America. Yes, he lost his way. Yes, he committed crimes that require punishment. But should 4 years of wrong choices erase 4 decades of service? From the corner of his eye, Lucas saw his mother's subtle reaction, a slight straightening of her spine, a tightening of her jaw. She'd heard similar justifications before, when Daniel had tried to explain away his abandonment of their family. "The prosecution speaks of justice," Reeves continued. "But true justice considers not just the crime, but the whole person. It weighs not just the harm done, but the good that came before. It acknowledges human frailty while upholding the law." Daniel sat motionless at the defense table, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. Was he seeing his past? His choices? The moments when he could have turned back but didn't? Mr. Rivera has admitted his guilt. He's cooperated fully with federal investigators, providing information that will help dismantle the very criminal organization that ensnared him. He's shown genuine remorse, not just for his crimes, but for all the ways he's failed to live up to his own principles. Reeves paused, letting his words sink in. The law demands punishment for his crimes, yes, but it also allows for mercy, where mercy is warranted. We ask you to consider both justice and mercy in your deliberations. As the defense concluded, Lucas prepared to give the jury their instructions. His voice remained steady as he explained points of law, burden of proof, the elements required for conviction. But beneath his judicial robes, his heart raced with the weight of what would come next. The jury will now retire to deliberate, he announced. Court is in recess until a verdict is reached. As the jurors filed out, Lucas caught a glimpse of his father being led away by the bailiff. Daniel's shoulders were slumped, his usual confident stride replaced by the shuffling gait of a man who had finally confronted the truth of his own failings. In his chambers, Lucas found Maria waiting. She didn't speak, just opened her arms as she had so many times before, when he'd skinned his knees as a child, when he'd struggled through law school, when he'd faced his first difficult case as a judge. "Mommy," he whispered, the professional mask slipping just a fraction. "You did what you had to do," she said softly. "Just like you've always done." The jury could be out for days. Maria stepped back, studying his face with the same loving scrutiny she'd given his childhood report cards. "They'll take the time they need, just like you've taken the time you needed to become the man you are." Outside his chamber's window, the Boston skyline sparkled in the late afternoon sun. Somewhere in those deliberation rooms, 12 citizens were weighing his father's fate. But here, in this moment, Lucas was simply a son who had survived abandonment, a judge who had maintained his integrity, a man who had proven that the sins of the father need not become the legacy of the son. Tomorrow would bring either verdict or continued deliberation. But tonight, in the quiet of his chambers, Lucas Rivera would remember every lesson his mother had taught him about justice, mercy, and the strength it takes to choose right over easy, truth over comfort, principle over blood. The first day of jury deliberation stretched into evening like a taut wire. Lucas sat in his chambers reviewing other cases on his docket, but his mind kept drifting to the 12 people sequestered in the jury room down the hall. Outside his window, Boston's winter sky had turned the color of old bruises. "Your Honor?" Richard Chen appeared at the door, his normally pristine shirt showing signs of a long day. "The jury has sent their third question." Lucas accepted the folded paper, recognizing the forewoman's neat handwriting. "Request to review Daniel Rivera's testimony regarding the June 15, 2019 transactions and related surveillance evidence. Have copies prepared for review," Lucas instructed. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As Richard left, Lucas's phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Dinner at Romano's? Like old times." He smiled, remembering countless meals at the small Italian restaurant near their old home in Brookline. It had been their refuge in the early days after Daniel left, when cooking felt like too much effort and silence at home was too heavy to bear. "Tell them to save us the corner booth," he texted back. The courtroom felt different in the evening light, shadows gathering in its high corners. The gallery was nearly empty as Lucas took the bench, save for a few dedicated reporters and Maria, who had barely left the courthouse since deliberations began. "Members of the jury," he addressed the 12 tired faces before him, "you've requested review of specific testimony and evidence. The clerk will provide copies now. Please remember my previous instructions regarding the context in which this evidence must be considered." As the jurors accepted the documents, Lucas studied their expressions. The forewoman, Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to his clerk, maintained her composed demeanor, but others showed signs of the emotional toll. A young software engineer wiped away tears as she reread Daniel's testimony about choosing money over attending his son's graduation. Once the jury retired again, Lucas removed his robes and met his mother in the courthouse lobby. The drive to Romano's was quiet, both lost in thought until Maria finally broke the silence. "I saw Christina today," she said softly. Lucas's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Christina Rodriguez, his father's former mistress, the woman who'd helped destroy their family. "Where?" "At the grocery store." She looked old, tired. Maria gazed out the window at passing streetlights. "She asked about you." "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that you became everything a mother could hope for, not despite what happened, but because of how we chose to handle it." At Romano's, they slid into their old corner booth. The owner, Vincent, greeted them warmly, not mentioning the trial splashed across local headlines but offering their usual orders without having to ask. Chicken parmigiana for Lucas, linguine with clam sauce for Maria. "I keep thinking about what Father O'Malley said," Maria admitted once Vincent had left. "About your father being broken by conscience rather than consequence." Lucas twirled pasta around his fork, considering. "Do you believe him?" "I believe people can change, but I also believe timing matters." She took a sip of water, choosing her words carefully. "Redemption means more when it comes before you're caught, not after." Back at the courthouse, the jury worked late into the night. At 9 p.m., they sent another question. Request clarification on sentencing guidelines for money laundering charges. Lucas provided the standard response about sentencing being the court's responsibility, not the jury's concern. But the question suggested they were moving toward verdict rather than deadlock. In the holding cell area, Daniel paced his small space. He'd refused dinner, his attorney reported, spending hours writing in a small notebook. Lucas wondered what words his father was trying to find. What explanation or justification or plea could possibly bridge the gulf of 25 years? Near midnight, Richard appeared with news that the jury wanted to break for the night. Lucas granted their request, setting resumption for 9 a.m. the next day. "You should go home, get some rest," he told his clerk. "Tomorrow might be a long day." But after Richard left, Lucas remained in his chambers, pulling out an old photograph he kept in his desk drawer. It showed a smiling 5-year-old boy on his father's shoulders at a Red Sox game. The boy's Yankees cap was proudly backward, a small act of rebellion that had made both father and son laugh. His phone buzzed again, another text from Maria. "Found this while cleaning." Attached was a photo of his law school graduation program, the one his father had never seen. "Do you ever regret staying so strong?" he texted back. "Never letting him see how much he hurt us?" Her response came quickly. "Strength isn't about not feeling pain, mi amor. It's about choosing what to do with it." The next morning dawned gray and cold. Lucas arrived early, watching sunrise paint the courthouse columns in shades of gold. One by one, the players in this drama arrived, jurors with coffee cups and determined expressions, attorneys reviewing notes one last time, reporters setting up cameras outside. At 10:30, a buzz from the jury room. "We have reached a verdict." The courtroom filled quickly, tension crackling like static electricity. Maria took her usual seat in the front row, her face serene but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel was led in, looking as if he hadn't slept at all. As the jury filed in, Lucas observed their faces, some red-eyed from crying, others set with grim determination. The forewoman handed the verdict form to the clerk, who passed it to Lucas for review. His hands didn't shake as he read the paper. His voice didn't waver as he handed it back. Years of judicial training held firm as he prepared to read his own father's fate. Dr. Chen stood, her voice clear in the hushed courtroom. "We, the jury, find the defendant." Through it all, Lucas watched his father's face, seeing not the defendant awaiting verdict, but flashes of the man he'd been. Pushing a swing, teaching baseball, making promises he wouldn't keep. The man who had given him life, then left him, to learn its hardest lessons alone. The verdict echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap, but Lucas's focus remained steady. There would be sentencing to consider, appeals to manage, justice to uphold. Beyond these walls, Boston's life continued. Traffic flowing, people hurrying past, the world spinning on its axis, unaware of the small drama of redemption and responsibility, playing out in courtroom 3. Later, he would sit with his mother at Romano's again, both processing the day's events. Later, he would return to his chambers and face the weight of decisions still to come. But for now, in this moment frozen between justice and mercy, Lucas Rivera was both judge and son, keeper of law and keeper of memories, proving that even the hardest choices can be faced with dignity if one's moral compass points true. Guilty on all counts. The words fell like stones in still water, ripples of reaction spreading through the courtroom. Daniel Rivera closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging not with surprise but with the final weight of certainty. In the gallery, Maria remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged as if she'd known this moment was written long ago. "The jury is thanked and excused," Lucas announced, his judicial voice steady and clear. "Sentencing will be scheduled for 2 weeks from today. The defendant is remanded to custody until that time." As the bailiff approached Daniel, Michael Reeves stood. "Your Honor, given my client's cooperation and voluntary surrender, we request he remain free on bond until sentencing." "Objection," Regina Walsh countered immediately. "The defendant has now been convicted of serious federal crimes. The flight risk is minimal," Reeves interrupted. "Mr. Rivera has surrendered his passport and has deep ties to the community." Lucas studied his father's face, seeing not the convicted money launderer but the man who had once taught him about justice, before betraying its principles. Motion denied. The defendant will remain in custody. As Daniel was led away, his eyes met Lucas's for a brief moment. In that glance, past 25 years of absence, regret, and something new, a recognition of the man his son had become, perhaps even a flicker of pride beneath the shame. The courtroom slowly emptied, reporters rushing out to file their stories about the prominent attorney convicted by his own son. Lucas remained on the bench, reviewing the verdict forms with methodical precision, each checkmark and signature a step toward final justice. Richard appeared at his side with a stack of documents. "The sentencing briefing schedule, Your Honor, and this was delivered to chambers during deliberations." Lucas accepted the sealed envelope, recognizing his father's handwriting. He placed it in his desk drawer without opening it. Some words needed to wait until the scales of justice had been fully balanced. In his chambers, he found Maria waiting, her presence as constant as the tides. "The jury did their duty," she said simply. "They deliberated for 18 hours, Lucas replied, removing his robes. "They took it seriously. As did you." She approached his desk, touching the corner where a water ring marked countless late nights of case review. "I saw his face when you denied the bond request. He finally understood." "Understood what?" "That you are truly a judge, not his son in judge's robes, but a real servant of justice." Lucas loosened his tie, feeling the weight of the past few days pressing down. "The sentencing guidelines are clear, 20 to 30 years, given the amount laundered and his position as an attorney. That's not what's troubling you, though, is it?" Maria's insight, sharp as ever, cut through his professional veneer. "The prosecutors will want my recusal for sentencing. They'll argue that family connection." "Will do what? Make you more lenient? More harsh?" She shook her head. "You've proven your integrity through this whole trial. The verdict shows that." A knock at the door interrupted them. Regina Walsh entered, her victory tempered by professional courtesy. "Your Honor, Mrs. Rivera, I wanted to inform you that we'll be filing a sentencing memorandum requesting the maximum penalty." "As is your right," Lucas acknowledged. "The defense will have standard time to respond." "We won't be opposing your presence at sentencing," Walsh added, surprising them both. "Your handling of the trial has been exemplary." After she left, Lucas sank into his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "Exemplary," he repeated. "Is that what we're calling it, when a son sends his father to prison?" No, Maria touched his shoulder. That's what we call it when a judge ensures justice is served no matter the personal cost. The next few days passed in a blur of media coverage and legal paperwork. The Boston Globe ran a front-page story. Judge Rivera, justice transcends blood. The ABA Journal requested an interview about maintaining judicial impartiality in extreme circumstances. Lucas declined them all. Instead, he focused on other cases, other defendants, other judgments. But in quiet moments, his mind returned to the sealed letter in his drawer and the approaching sentencing date. A week after the verdict, he received a request from the detention center. Daniel wanted to see him, not as a judge, but as a son. Lucas stared at the request form for a long time before writing his response. All contact must wait until after sentencing. That night, unable to sleep, he drove to their old house in Brookline. The new owners had painted it blue, replaced the swing set with a garden. But if he closed his eyes, he could still see himself at 5 years old, playing catch with a father who seemed larger than life, who promised to always be there, who taught him about justice before teaching him about betrayal. His phone buzzed. A text from Maria. Can't sleep either? How did you know? Mothers always know. Come over. I made chocolate caliente. At his mother's kitchen table, cradling a mug of hot chocolate like he had countless times as a child, Lucas finally spoke the words he'd been holding back. What if I'm too harsh because of our history? What if I'm too lenient trying to prove I'm not biased? How do I separate 25 years of abandoned birthdays from an appropriate federal sentence? Maria was quiet for a long moment, stirring her own chocolate thoughtfully. When you were 10, she finally said, you came home crying because Miguel Ramirez stole your Yankees cap, remember? Lucas nodded, unsure where she was going. You wanted revenge, to steal his basketball, break his skateboard. Instead, you reported him to the principal. When I asked why, you said, because it's right, not because it feels good. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. You've always known the difference between justice and vengeance, mi amor. Trust that knowledge now. The next morning, Lucas finally opened his father's letter. The pages were filled with memories, moments Lucas had forgotten or tried to forget. The day he'd hit his first home run. The night Daniel had explained constellations on a camping trip. The morning everything changed. But it wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a confession. Deeper than the one given in court. An acknowledgement not just of crimes against the law, but of failures as a father, as a husband, as a man. The final paragraph read, I watched you on that bench, conducting my trial with more integrity than I've shown in my entire life, and I finally understood what your mother built from the ashes of my betrayal. She created a true judge, not because of me, but in spite of me. Whatever sentence you give will be just, because justice lives in you in a way it never did in me. Lucas carefully refolded the letter, placing it back in his drawer. 2 days until sentencing. 2 days to weigh justice against mercy, law against humanity, duty against blood. Outside his window, Boston was waking up. Lawyers climbed the courthouse steps carrying briefcases full of other stories, other crimes, other judgments. Soon he would don his robes again, take the bench, continue serving justice in cases that didn't tear at his soul. But for now, in the quiet of early morning, Lucas Rivera sat with the weight of his father's words and the approaching moment when he would have to prove one final time that justice truly was blind, even when looking into the eyes of the man who had first taught him its meaning, then its cost. The morning of the sentencing hearing dawned with a heavy snowfall that blanketed Boston in silence. Lucas stood at his chamber's window, watching white flakes swirl against gray sky, his judge's robes feeling heavier than usual on his shoulders. The courtroom's ready, Your Honor, Richard announced softly. Standing room only. They've come to see the son sentence the father, Lucas said more to himself than his clerk, like some modern Greek tragedy. They've come to see justice, Richard corrected gently, which is what you've provided throughout this trial. The courtroom was indeed packed when Lucas took the bench. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised over notepads. Legal interns squeezed into every available space, eager to witness what would surely become a case study in judicial ethics. Maria sat in her usual spot, wearing the blue dress she'd worn to Lucas's judicial investiture ceremony. Daniel entered in custody, wearing a suit that hung slightly loose on his frame after weeks in detention. The proud posture of a successful attorney had given way to something more honest, a man finally facing the full weight of his choices. "We're here for sentencing in case number 2025 CR 1142, United States versus Daniel Rivera," Lucas began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed chamber. "We'll begin with the government's sentencing recommendation." Regina Walsh approached the podium. "Your Honor, given the severity of the crimes, the defendant's position as an officer of the court, and the extensive nature of his cooperation with the cartel, the government recommends the maximum sentence of 30 years. Lucas nodded, making notes with the same precise handwriting his mother had insisted he develop in elementary school. "Mr. Reeves?" Michael Reeves stood, looking older than he had at the trial's start. "Your Honor, while we acknowledge the seriousness of these crimes, we ask the court to consider Mr. Rivera's decades of service to the legal community, his extensive cooperation with investigators after his arrest, and his genuine remorse. We request the minimum sentence of 20 years. Does the defendant wish to make a statement before sentencing?" Daniel rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the podium. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. "Your Honor," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Lucas." "Mr. Rivera," Lucas's voice held a warning note, "please maintain appropriate courtroom protocol." Daniel nodded, accepting the rebuke. "I apologize, Your Honor. I stand before this court having betrayed every principle I once claimed to uphold. I betrayed the law, my profession, my clients. But those weren't my first or most grievous betrayals." In the gallery, Maria's hands tightened on her purse strap, but her expression remained serene. 25 years ago, I abandoned my 5-year-old son and his mother for what I thought was love but was really just selfish desire. I traded my family's trust for momentary passion, their stability for temporary excitement. That betrayal set a pattern in my life, choosing the easy wrong over the hard right, immediate gratification over lasting integrity. Lucas maintained his judicial mask, but beneath his robes his heart raced with memories. Waiting by the window for a father who wouldn't come, watching his mother work 2 jobs to keep their home, building a life from the ashes of abandonment. When the cartel approached me, I told myself I deserved their money. That after losing my family, losing my reputation, I was owed something. Each transaction became easier than the last. Each lie smoothed the way for bigger deceptions. I didn't just fall from grace, I dove headlong into disgrace. The courtroom was utterly silent now, every person leaning forward slightly, witnessing a confession that went beyond legal guilt to something more fundamentally human. But sitting in this courtroom, watching my son, watching Your Honor conduct this trial with unshakable integrity, I finally understood the full measure of what I'd thrown away, not just my family but my own character, my soul, if you will. Daniel's voice broke slightly. He took a moment to compose himself before continuing. "I watched Your Honor ensure that justice was served without bias or personal feeling, and I saw what a real man of principle looks like. I saw what my son became not because of me, but in spite of me. Whatever sentence this court imposes will be just, because justice lives in this courtroom in a way it never did in my law practice." Lucas felt Maria's gaze from the gallery, steady, supporting, reminding him of every lesson she'd taught about strength and duty. "I don't ask for leniency. I ask only that this court know that my greatest punishment isn't the years I'll serve, but the knowledge of what I lost when I first chose self-interest over family, and every time after when I chose profit over principle. Thank you, Your Honor." As Daniel sat down, Lucas reviewed the sentencing guidelines one final time, though he'd memorized them weeks ago. The law was clear about minimum and maximum terms, but within that range lay the true test of justice, finding the point where punishment served both law and humanity. "The court has considered all factors required by statute," Lucas began, his voice steady. "The severity of the crimes, the defendant's position of trust, his cooperation after arrest, and his evident remorse. We've weighed the need for punishment against the potential for rehabilitation, the demands of justice against the possibilities of redemption. He paused, looking out over the crowded courtroom. So many eyes watching, so many ears listening, all waiting to hear how a son would judge his father. Mr. Rivera, your crimes strike at the heart of our justice system. As an attorney, you were sworn to uphold the law, not profit from its violation. You used your position of trust to facilitate criminal enterprises, choosing personal gain over professional ethics. These actions demand significant punishment. Daniel nodded, accepting each word like a physical blow. However, this court also acknowledges your eventual cooperation with authorities, your clear expression of remorse, and your acceptance of responsibility. These factors, while not excusing your crimes, suggest the possibility of genuine rehabilitation. Lucas gripped his gavel, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down like his robes. Before pronouncing sentence, I am compelled to address the unique circumstances of this case. Many have questioned whether family connection would influence this court's judgment, suggesting either undue harshness from old wounds or excessive leniency from blood ties. The reporters' pens scratched frantically across notepads. But justice must transcend personal history. It must rise above individual emotion to serve the greater principles of law and order. The sentence I impose today is not a son's revenge or a father's forgiveness. It is the judgment of this court, based solely on the facts presented and the requirements of justice. Maria sat straighter in her seat, pride visible in every line of her posture. Daniel Rivera, please rise. As his father stood, Lucas felt the weight of generations, his Puerto Rican grandparents who'd sacrificed everything for education, his mother who'd taught him strength through dignity, and his own long journey from abandoned child to upholder of justice. The sentence, when he pronounced it, rang through the courtroom like a bell tolling truth and consequence, marking the moment when justice and family history collided in courtroom 3 of the Boston Federal Courthouse, where a son fulfilled his duty while a father finally faced the full price of betrayal. 25 years. The sentence fell into the hushed courtroom like a stone into still water. 25 years, the same amount of time Daniel Rivera had been absent from his son's life, now matched in years he would serve for his crimes. This sentence, Lucas continued, his voice unwavering, reflects both the severity of your crimes and your eventual cooperation with authorities. You will serve no less than 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Additionally, you are ordered to forfeit all assets gained through criminal activity and pay restitution in the amount of $15 million. Daniel remained standing, his posture straight, but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The symmetry of the sentence wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. 25 years of freedom traded for 25 years of confinement. The court also recommends placement at FCI Danbury to facilitate family visitation, should any family members wish to maintain contact during your incarceration. Lucas paused, allowing the full weight of his words to settle. Do you understand this sentence as I have pronounced it? Yes, Your Honor. Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. Then this court is adjourned. The crack of the gavel echoed through the chamber like a final punctuation mark on their shared history. As the bailiff led Daniel away, he turned slightly, catching one last glimpse of his son on the bench, of Maria in the gallery. In that moment, his face held not anger or despair, but a kind of peace, the peace of a man who had finally faced the truth of his choices and accepted their consequences. The courtroom slowly emptied, reporters rushing to file their stories, lawyers gathering their materials, spectators discussing the poetry of the sentence in hushed tones. Lucas remained seated, watching as Richard efficiently organized the day's documents. The press will want statements, his clerk reminded him gently. They'll have to settle for the official court record, Lucas replied, rising from the bench. Some things shouldn't be discussed in sound bites. In his chambers, he found Maria waiting, her eyes bright with unshed tears of her own. 25 years, she said softly. The guidelines suggested between 20 and 30. I split the difference based on, mi amor, she interrupted. You don't have to justify your decision. Not to me. Not to anyone. He sank into his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of every decision, every moment of maintained composure, every careful separation of personal history from professional duty. Did I do right, Mommy? You did justice, she answered, moving to stand behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders just as they had when he was a boy struggling with difficult homework. Which is all any judge can do, and more than most fathers would have taught you. A knock at the door interrupted them. Regina Walsh entered, her victory tempered by the gravity of the moment. Your Honor, I wanted to say, that was the most ethically sound handling of a difficult case I've seen in 20 years of prosecution. After she left, Lucas opened his desk drawer and removed the letter his father had written, the one he'd read before sentencing. He knew, he said, holding up the pages. He predicted I'd choose justice over vendetta. Because he finally saw you clearly, Maria replied. Not as the little boy he left behind, but as the man you've become. Later that evening, as snow continued to fall over Boston, Lucas and Maria sat in their booth at Romano's. Vincent had seen the news and brought their usual orders without asking, along with a bottle of his best wine for justice served. I keep thinking about what Dad wrote, Lucas said, breaking the contemplative silence. About understanding what you built from the ashes of his betrayal. Maria twirled pasta around her fork, considering her words carefully. I didn't build anything alone, mi amor. We built it together, you and I. Every time you chose dignity over bitterness, every time you worked twice as hard to prove yourself, every time you put principle above pain, we were building something stronger than betrayal. A legacy of honor instead of hurt? Exactamente. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. And today, you proved that legacy will live beyond both the betrayal and the judgment. The next morning, Lucas returned to his regular docket. Other cases, other defendants, other decisions awaited. But something had shifted, not just in him, but in the very air of his courtroom. The reporters noted it, writing about the subtle change in his already respected judicial demeanor, a deeper gravity, a more profound understanding of justice's human cost. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from FCI Danbury. Lucas recognized his father's handwriting but noted it was addressed to both him and Maria. Inside, they found not excuses or appeals, but something rarer, acceptance. 25 years is perfect justice, Daniel had written. 1 year of penance for each year of abandonment. But while I serve my sentence, I want you both to know that watching Lucas maintain his integrity throughout my trial gave me something I never expected. Hope. Hope that while I failed as a father, the son succeeded beyond measure as a man. And hope that someday, when I've served my time and proved my own capacity for change, I might earn the right to know the person he's become. Maria read the letter, twice before carefully folding it away. Will you visit him? She asked, her voice free of judgment. Lucas stood at his mother's kitchen window, looking out at the garden where she'd taught him to grow things in soil enriched by composted pain. Maybe, he said finally. Not as a son at first, but as a man who believes in redemption, in the power of facing truth, in the possibility of growth even in life's winter. She nodded, understanding as she always had. Justice with mercy, she murmured. The hardest balance, but the most necessary. That night, in his own home, Lucas looked at the photo he kept on his desk. Not the old one of a happy family now fractured, but a new one taken at his judicial investiture. In it, he and Maria stood together, her face beaming with pride, his own expression serious but serene. It was a portrait not of what had been lost, but of what had been built from loss's lessons. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new tests of his judicial wisdom. But tonight, Judge Lucas Rivera sat in the quiet of his study, at peace with the knowledge that he had served justice while honoring truth, had maintained integrity while acknowledging humanity, had proven that the sins of the father need not determine the character of the son. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled like stars, each one perhaps illuminating another story of failure and redemption, of justice and mercy, of choices and their consequences. But here in this moment, one such story had found, if not its ending, then at least its proper moral. That true justice, like true character, is built not from the absence of challenges, but from how we rise to meet them. If you were Judge Lucas Rivera, how would you handle the burden of judging your own father? Justice demands that we ignore blood ties, but to what extent can we really separate professional duty from personal trauma? Leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.